Hi everyone, I'm reading Global Woman, Nannies, Maids, and Sex Workers in the New Economy by Arlie Hochschild. And today's chapter is called Made to Order, M-A-I-D, and it's written by Barbara Ehrenreich, who is also the editor of this book. So let's just get started. As class polarization grows, the classic posture of submission makes a stealthy comeback. We scrub your floors the old-fashioned way, boasts the brochure from Merry Maids, the largest of the residential cleaning services that have sprung up in the last 2 decades, on our hands and knees. This is not a posture that independent cleaning ladies willingly assume, preferring, like most people who clean their own homes, the sponge mop yielding from a standing position. In her comprehensive guide to homemaking, Cheryl Mendelson warns, never ask hired house cleaners to clean your floors on their hands and knees. The request is likely to be regarded as degrading. But in a society where 40% of the wealth is owned by 1% of households, while the bottom 20% reports negative assets, the degradation of others is readily purchased. Knee pads entered American political discourse as a tool of the sexually subservient, but employees of Merry Maids, the Maids International, and other new corporate-run cleaning services spend hours every day on these kinky devices, wiping up the drippings of the affluent. I spent 3 weeks in September 1999 as an employee of the Maids International in a New England city, cleaning, along with my fellow team members, approximately 60 houses, containing a total of about 250 scrubbable floors, bathrooms, kitchens, and entryways requiring the hands and knees treatment. It's a different world down there below knee level, one that few adults voluntarily enter. Here you find elaborate dust structures held together by a scaffolding of dog hairs, dried bits of pasta glued to the floor by their sauce, the congealed remains of gravies, jellies, contraceptive creams, vomit, and urine. Sometimes, too, you encounter some fragment of a human being, a child's legs, stamping by in disgust because the maids are still present when he gets home from school, or, more commonly, the Joan and David clad feet and electrolyzed calves of the female homeowner. Look up and you may find this person staring at you, arms folded, in anticipation of an overlooked stain. In rare instances, she may try to help in some vague, symbolic way by moving the cockatoo's cage, for example, or apologizing for the leaves shed by a miniature indoor tree. Mostly, though, she will not see you at all, and may even sit down with her mail at a table in the very room you are cleaning, while she will remain completely unaware of your existence, unless you were to crawl under the table and start gnawing away at her ankles. Housework, as you may recall from the feminist theories of the 1960s and 1970s, was supposed to be the great equalizer of women. Whatever else women did, jobs, school, childcare, we also did housework. And if there were some women who hired others to do it for them, they seemed too privileged and rare to include in the theoretical calculus. All women were workers, and the home was their workplace, unpaid and unsupervised to be sure, but a workplace no less than the offices and factories men repaired to every morning. If men thought of the home as a site of leisure and recreation, a haven in a heartless world, this was to ignore the invisible female proletariat that kept it cozy and humming. We were on the march then, or so we imagined, united against a society that devalued our labor even as it whacked mawkish over the family and the home. Shoulder to shoulder and arm, women were finally getting up off the floor. In the most eye-catching elaboration of the home as workplace theme, in 1972, Marxist feminists Maria Rose Della Costa and Selma James proposed that the home was in fact an economically productive and significant workplace, an extension of the actual factory, since housework served to reproduce the labor power of others, particularly men. The male worker would hardly be in shape to punch in for a shift, after all, if some woman had not fed him, laundered his clothes, and cared for the children who were his contribution to the next generation of workers. If the home was a quasi-industrial workplace staffed by women for the ultimate benefit of the capitalists, then wages for housework was the obvious demand. But when most American feminists, Marxist or otherwise, asked the Marxist question, cui bono, they tended to come up with a far simpler answer. Men. If women were the domestic proletariat, then men made up the class of domestic exploiters, free to lounge while their mates scrubbed. In consciousness-grazing groups, we railed over husbands and boyfriends who refused to pick up after themselves, who were unaware of housework at all, unless of course it hadn't been done. The dropped socks left by a man for a woman to gather up and launder joined lipstick and spike heels as emblems of gender oppression. When somewhere a man dropped a sock with the calm expectation that his wife would retrieve it, it was a sock heard round the world. Wherever second-wave feminism took root, battles broke out between lovers or spouses over sticky countertops, piled up laundry, and whose turn it was to do the dishes. The radical new idea was that housework was not only a relationship between a woman and a dust bunny or an unmade bed, it also defined a relationship between human beings, typically husbands and wives. This marked a departure from the more conservative views of Betty Friedan, who, in the feminist mystique, never thought to enter men into the equation, either as part of the housework problem or part of an eventual solution. She raged against a society that consigned its educated women to what she saw as essentially janitorial chores, beneath the abilities of a woman of average or normal intelligence, and, according to unidentified studies she cited, peculiarly suited to the capacities of feeble-minded girls. But men are virtually exempt from housework in the feminine mystique. Why drag them down too? At one point she even disparaged a Mrs. G, who somehow couldn't get her housework done before her husband came home at night, and was so tired then that he had to do it. Educated women would just have to become more efficient so that housework could no longer expand to fill the time available. Or they could hire other women to do it, an option Friedan approved in the feminine mystique. So did the National Organization for Women, which Friedan helped launch. At the 1973 congressional hearings on whether to extend the Fair Labor Standards Act to household workers, now testified to attract more women to the field, or now testified to the affirmative, arguing that improved wages and working conditions would attract more women to the field, and that the demand for household help inside the home will continue to increase as more women seek occupations outside the home. One Young Now member added on a personal note, "Like many young women today, I am in school in order to develop a rewarding career for myself. I also have a home to run and can fully conceive of the need for household help as my free time at home becomes more and more restricted. Women know that housework is dirty, tedious work, and they are willing to pay to have it done." On the aspirations of the women paid to do it, assuming at least some of them were bright enough to entertain a few, neither Friedan nor these members of Now had, at the time, a word to say. So the insight that distinguished the more radical post-Friedan cohort of feminists was that when we talked about housework, we were really talking yet again about power. Housework was not degrading because it was manual labor, as Friedan thought, but because it was embedded in degrading relationships and inevitably served to reinforce them. To make a mess that another person will have to deal with, the dropped socks, the toothpaste sprayed on the bathroom mirror, the dirty dishes left from a late-night snack, is to exert domination in one of its more silent and intimate forms. One person's arrogance, or indifference, or hurry, becomes another person's occasion for toil. And when the person who is cleaned up after is consistently male, while the person who cleans up is consistently female, you have a formula for reproducing male domination from one generation to the next. Hence, the feminist perception of housework is one more way by which men exploit women, or more neutrally stated, as a symbolic enactment of gender relations. An early German woman's liberation cartoon depicted a woman on her hands and knees while her husband, apparently excited by this pose, approaches from behind, unzipping his fly. Hence, too, the second-wave feminist revulsion at the hiring of maids, especially when they were women of color. At a feminist conference I attended in 1980, the poet Audre Lorde chose to insult the all-too-white audience by accusing them of being present only because they had black housekeepers to look after their children at home. She had the wrong crowd. Most of the assembled radical feminists would no sooner have employed a black maid than they would have attached Confederate flag stickers to the rear windows of their cars. But accusations like hers, repeated in countless conferences and meetings, reinforced our rejection of the servant option. There already were at least two able-bodied adults in the average home, a man and a woman, and the hope was that after a few initial skirmishes they would learn to share the housework graciously. A couple of decades later, however, the average household still falls far short of that goal. True, women do less housework than they did before the feminist revolution and the rise of the two-income family, down from an average of 30 hours per week in 1965 to 17.5 hours in 1995, according to a July 1999 study from the University of Maryland. Some of that decline reflects a relaxation of the standards rather than a redistribution of chores. Women still do 2/3 of whatever housework, including bill paying, pet care, tidying, and lawn maintenance, gets done. The inequity is sharpest for the most despised of household chores, cleaning. Between 1965 and 1995, men increased the time they spent scrubbing, vacuuming, and sweeping by 240%, all the way up to 1.7 hours per week, while women decreased their cleaning time by only 7% to 6.7 hours per week. The averages conceal a variety of arrangements, of course, from minutely negotiated sharing to the most cliched division of labor, as described by one woman in the Washington Post. "I take care of the inside, he takes care of the outside." But perhaps the most disturbing finding is that almost all the increase in male participation took place between the 1970s and the mid-1980s. 15 years after the apparent cessation of hostilities, it is probably not too soon to call the question. In the chore wars of the 1970s and 1980s, Women gained a little ground, but overall, and after a few strategic concessions, men won. Enter then the cleaning lady as Dea ex machina, restoring tranquility as well as order to the home. Marriage counselors recommend hiring them as an alternative to squabbling, as do many within the residential cleaning industry itself. A Chicago cleaning woman quotes one of her clients as saying that if she were to give up the service, my husband and I will be divorced in 6 months. Managers of the new corporate cleaning services, such as the one I worked for, attribute their success not only to the influx of women into the workforce, but to the tensions over housework that arose in its wake. When the trend toward hiring out was just beginning to take off in 1988, the owner of a Merry Maids franchise in Arlington, Massachusetts, told the Christian Science Monitor, "I kid some women. I say, we even save marriages. In this new 80s period, you expect more from the male partner, but very often you don't get the cooperation you would like to have. The alternative is to pay somebody to come in." Another Merry Maids franchise owner has learned to capitalize more directly on housework-related spats. He closes 30 to 35% of his sales by making follow-up calls on Saturday mornings, the prime time for arguing over the fact that the house is a mess. The micro-defeat of feminism in the household opened a new door for women, only this time it was the servant's entrance. In 1999, somewhere between 14 and 18% of households employed outsiders to do their cleaning, and the numbers have been rising dramatically since. MediaMark Research reports a 53% increase between 1995 and 1999 in the number of households using a hired cleaner or service once a month or more, and Moritz finds that 30% of the people who hired help in 1999 did so for the first time that year. Among my middle-class professional women friends and acquaintances, including some who made important contributions to the early feminist analysis of housework 2.5 decades ago, the employment of a cleaning person is now nearly universal. The home, or at least the affluent home, is finally becoming what radical feminists in the 1970s only imagined it was: a workplace for women and a tiny, though increasingly visible, part of the capitalist economy. The question is this: as your home becomes a workplace for someone else, is it still a place you want to live? Strangely, or perhaps not so strangely at all, no one talks about the politics of housework anymore. The demand for wages of housework no longer has the power to polarize feminist conferences. It has sunk to the status of a curio, along with the consciousness-raising groups in which women once rallied support in their struggles with messy men. In the academy, according to the feminist sociologists I interviewed, housework has lost much of its former cachet. In fact, in part, I suspect because fewer sociologists actually do it. Most Americans, more than 80%, still clean their homes, but the minority who do not include a sizable fraction of the nation's opinion makers and culture producers: professors, writers, editors, media decision makers, political figures, talking heads, and celebrities of all sorts. In their homes, the politics of housework is becoming a politics not only of gender, but also of race and class. And these are the subjects that the opinion-making elite, if not most Americans, generally prefer to avoid. Even the number of paid household workers is hard to pin down. The Census Bureau reports that there were 549,000 domestic workers in 1998, up 9% since 1996, but this may be a considerable underestimate since so much of the servant economy is still underground. In 1993, for example, the year when Zoe Baird lost her chance to be Attorney General for paying her undocumented immigrant nanny off the books, the Los Angeles Times reported that fewer than 10% of those Americans who paid a house cleaner reported these payments to the IRS. Sociologist Mary Romero, one of the few academics who retains an active interest in housework and the women who do it for pay, offers an example of how severe the undercounting can be. The 1980 census found only 1,063 private household workers in El Paso, Texas, although at the time, the city's Department of Planning, Research, and Development estimated these workers' numbers at 13,400, and local bus drivers estimated that half of the 28,300 daily bus trips were taken by maids going to and returning from work. The honesty of employers has increased since the Baird scandal, but most experts believe that household workers remain in large part uncounted and invisible to the larger economy. One thing you can say with certainty about the population of household workers is that they are disproportionately women of color, lower kinds of people for a lower kind of work. Of the private household cleaners and servants it managed to locate in 1998, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reports that 36.8% were Hispanic, 15.8% Black, and 2.7% other. Certainly the association between house cleaning and minority status is well established in the psyches of the white employing class. When my daughter Rosa was introduced to the wealthy father of a Harvard classmate, He ventured that she must have been named for a favorite maid. And Audre Lorde can perhaps be forgiven for her intemperate accusation at the feminist conference mentioned above when we consider an experience she had in 1967. I wheel my 2-year-old daughter in a shopping cart through a supermarket, and a little white girl riding past in her mother's cart calls out excitedly, "Oh, look, Mommy, a baby maid." The composition of the household workforce is hardly fixed, and it has changed with the life chances of the different ethnic groups. In the late 19th century, Irish and German immigrants served the upper urban and middle classes, then left for the factories as soon as they could. Black women replaced them, accounting for 60% of all domestics in the 1940s and dominating the field until other occupations opened to them. Similarly, West Coast maids were disproportionately Japanese American until that group found more congenial options. Today, the color of the hand that pushes the sponge varies from region to region. Chicanas in the Southwest, Caribbeans in New York, Native Hawaiians in Hawaii, Native whites, many of recent rural extraction in the New England city where I briefly worked. The great majority, although again no one knows the exact numbers, of paid housekeepers are freelancers or independents who find their clients through agencies or networks of already employed friends and relatives. To my acquaintances in the employing class, the freelance housekeeper seems to be a fairly privileged and prosperous type of worker, sometimes paid $15 an hour or more, and usually said to be viewed as a friend or even as one of the family. But the shifting ethnic composition of the workforce tells another story. Many women have been trapped in this kind of work, whether by racism, imperfect English skills, immigration status, or lack of education. Few happily choose it. Interviews with independent maids collected by Romero and by sociologist Judith Rowlands, who herself worked as a maid in the Boston area in the early 80s, confirm the undesirability of the work to those who perform it. Even when the pay is deemed acceptable, the hours may be long and unpredictable. There is no job security. There are usually no health benefits. And if the employer has failed to pay Social Security taxes, in some cases because the maid herself prefers to be paid off the books, there are no retirement benefits. And the pay is often far from acceptable. The BLS found that full-time private household workers and servants earning a median income of $223 a week in 1998, which is $23 a week below the poverty level for a family of 3. Recall that in 1993, Zoe Baird paid her undocumented household workers $5 an hour out of her earnings of $507,000 a year. At the most lurid extreme, there is slavery. A few cases of captivity and forced labor pop up in the press every year, most recently involving undocumented women held in servitude by high-ranking staff members of the United Nations, the World Bank, and the International Monetary Fund. Consider the charges brought by Elizabeth Senghor, a Senegalese woman who told the court that her Manhattan employers forced her to work 14-hour days without any regular pay and with no accommodations beyond a pull-out bed in her employer's living room. Hers is not a particularly startling instance of domestic slavery. No beatings or sexual assaults were charged, and Mrs. Senghor was apparently fed. What gives this case a certain rueful poignancy is that her employer, former UN employee Marie-Angelique Savon, is one of Senegal's leading women's rights advocates and had told the Christian Science Monitor in 1986 about her efforts to get the Senegalese to realize that being a woman can mean other things than simply having children and taking care of the house. Mostly, though, independent maids and their employers complain about the peculiar intimacy of the employer-employee relationship. Domestic service is an occupation that predates the refreshing impersonality of capitalism by several thousand years, conditions of work being still largely defined by the idiosyncrasies of the employers. Some of them seek friendship and even what their maids describe as therapy, though they are usually quick to redraw the lines once the maid is perceived as overstepping. Others demand deference, bordering on servility, while an increasing portion of the nouveau riche is simply out of control. In August 1999, the New York Times reported on the growing problem of dinner parties in upscale homes being disrupted by hostesses screaming at their help. To the verbal abuse, add published reports of sexual and physical assaults, the teenage son of an employer, for example, kicking a live-in nanny for refusing to make sandwiches for him and his friends after school. For better or worse, capitalist rationality is finally making some headway into this pre-industrial backwater. Nationwide and even international cleaning services like Mary Maids, Molly Maids, and the Maids International, all of which have arisen since the 1970s, now control 20 to 25% of the $1.4 billion house cleaning business, and perhaps their greatest innovation has been to abolish the mistress-maid relationship with all its quirks and dependencies. The customer hires the service, not the maid, who has been replaced anyway by a team of 2 to 4 uniformed people, only one of whom, the team leader, is usually authorized to speak to the customer about the work at hand. The maids' wages, their social security taxes, their green cards, backaches, and childcare problems are the sole concern of the company, meaning that local franchise owner. If there are complaints on either side, they are addressed to the franchise owner. The customer and the actual workers need never interact. Since the franchise owner is usually a middle-class white person, cleaning services are the ideal solution for anyone still sensitive enough to find the traditional employer-maid relationship morally vexing. In a 1997 article about Merry Maids, Franchise Times reported tersely that the category is booming and that the niche is hot too, as Americans look to outsource work even at home. Not all cleaning services do well. There is a high rate of failure among the informal mom-and-pop services, like one I applied to by phone that did not even require a cursory interview. All I would have had to do was show up at 7 the next morning. The boom is concentrated among the national and international chains, outfits like Merry Maids, Molly Maids, Mini Maids, Maid Brigade, and the Maids International, all named, curiously enough, to highlight the more antique aspects of the industry, although the maid may occasionally be male. In 1996, Merry Maids claimed to be growing at 15 to 20% a year, while spokespersons for Molly Maids and the Maids International each told me that their firm's sales are growing by 25% a year. Local franchisors are equally bullish. My boss at the Maids confided to me that he could double his business overnight if only he could find enough reliable employees. To this end, the Maids offer a week of paid vacation, health insurance after 90 days, and a free breakfast every morning, consisting, at least where I worked, of coffee, donuts, bagels, and bananas. Some franchisees have dealt with the tight labor market by participating in welfare-to-work projects that not only funnel them employees, but often subsidize their paychecks with public money, at least from the first few months of work, which doesn't mean that the newly minted maid earns more, only that the company has to pay her less. The Merry Maids franchise in the city where I worked is conveniently located a block away from the city's welfare office. Among the women I worked with at the Maids, only one said she had previously worked as an independent, and she professed to be pleased with her new status as a cleaning service employee. She no longer needed a car to get her from house to house, and she could take a day off, unpaid of course, to stay home with a sick child without risking the loss of a customer. Cleaning services are an especially appealing option for recent immigrants, who are unlikely to have cars or the contacts they would need to work as independents. Large services like the Maids have videotapes used for training new hires in Spanish and well as English. I myself could see the advantage of not having to deal directly with the customers, who were sometimes at home while we worked and eager to make use of their supervisory skills. Criticisms of our methods, as well as demands that we perform unscheduled tasks, could simply be referred to the team leader or, beyond her, to the franchise owner. But workers inevitably face losses when an industry moves from the entrepreneurial to the industrial phase, most strikingly in this case in the matter of pay. At Merry Maids, I was promised $200 for a 40-hour week, with the manager hastening to add that you can't calculate it in dollars per hour since the 40 hours includes all the time spent traveling from house to house, up to 5 houses a day, which is unpaid. The Maids International, with its straightforward starting rate of $6.63 an hour, seemed preferable, although this rate was conditional on perfect attendance. Miss one day and your wage dropped to $6 an hour for 2 weeks, a rule that weighed particularly heavy on those who had young children. In addition, I soon learned that management had ways of shaving off nearly an hour's worth of wages a day. We were told to arrive at 7:30 in the morning, but our billable hours began only after we had been teamed up, given our list of houses for the day, and packed off in the company car at around 8. At the end of the day, we were no longer paid from the moment we left the car, although as much as 15 minutes of work, sorting through the rags dirtied in the course of the day, refilling cleaning fluid bottles, and the like, remained to be done in the office. So for a standard 9-hour day, the actual pay amounted to about $6.06 an hour, unless you were still being punished for an absence, in which case it came out to $5.48 an hour. Nor are cleaning service employees likely to receive any of the perks or tips familiar to independents: free lunches and coffee, cast-off clothing, or a Christmas gift of cash. When I asked, only one of my coworkers could recall ever receiving a tip, and that was a voucher for a free meal at a downtown restaurant owned by a customer. More than a year later, she still hadn't used it, probably because she would have to eat alone, the $20 or so for a companion's meal being out of the question. The customers of cleaning services are probably no stingier than the employees of independents. They just don't know they're cleaning people and probably wouldn't recognize them on the street. They may even get a different crew each visit. Besides, customers probably assume that the fee they pay the service, $25 per person hour in the case of my franchise of the maids, goes largely to the workers who do the actual cleaning. All right, I'm going to take a break there because this is going to be really long if I don't, and then I will finish this chapter in part 2. Thanks. Bye.